Cesar, if you don't mind, you can start sharing your screen and jump into your presentation. Looking forward to learning from you today, and please introduce yourself.
All right, here we go. Thank you very much. I'm super thankful and excited to be able to be here with you guys, to be able to share and specifically be able to help you with what I think is a superpower. I was actually in the breakout room just now and I was telling them that once I found out that knowing how to tell good stories is a superpower and that the best leaders and that the best communicators in the world tell the best stories, I went all in. And that's my idea today in the 15, 20 minutes that I'll be sharing a presentation is to give you all something very practical, something very concrete, so you can start also upgrading your own personal stories. Now, I do have, unfortunately,
Cesar, you muted yourself.
right there. Can you hear me
There we
now?
go.
All
Yes.
right. All right. I was saying that unfortunately I have some bad news. I don't like to start out with bad news, but for anyone who wants to influence, for anyone that wants to be able to get their message out, whether that be through their marketing or a personal brand, or you have a message that you want to get out to the world, the bad news is that we live in a world today where it's probably never been harder to be able to grab our audience's attention. Research has shown that on average, we're bombarded by about 5,000 images, messages, videos a day. And that's gone up a lot the last few years. And that makes it challenging for all of us who are trying to get our message out, because if we can't grab our audience's attention, we won't have any influence, right? No attention means no influence. And our message and whatever we want to get across might be super important. I always tell my clients, sometimes you might even have the cure to a disease. But if you can't grab your audience's attention, you won't be able to influence. And when it comes to leadership, because I know a lot of you here are in leadership positions or you're leading your own organization, one of the best definitions that I've read and that I really makes sense to me about leadership is actually one from Dwight Eisenhower, who was a great, general and president in the United States. And he, talking about influence, actually said that the art of influence is being able to get others to do what you want, but because they want to do it. That's the challenge, right? How do we get others to do what we want, but because they want to do it? And this is a question that I've asked myself for a long, long time. How do you get people to want to do something when you have a message, when you have a solution? How do you get people to buy in? And the way that I got the answer to this question was actually in the weirdest, most unconventional way. And let me give you a little bit of context. Okay, I have 4 kids. The youngest are twins, and out of the twins, they're fraternal twins. They have a boy and a girl. The boy is actually, he is the smallest. He was born weighing about 3.5 pounds. He was very premature. So the doctors, they told us from the very beginning, he's going to have a few issues as he's growing up, especially his first few years. He's going to have respiratory issues because his lungs didn't develop well. And you guys have to be really, really careful and making sure he doesn't get sick. And when he was about 4 or 5 years old, he started in the wintertime, started getting a little bit congested. He got a little bit sick, and we got, worried, and we took him quickly to his doctor. And she saw him and she said, well, I'm glad you guys brought him in really quick because he's starting to get an infection in his lungs. So it's really, really important that you give him an antibiotic. And she gave us a medication. It was like a syrup. She said, it's not good, but you got to make sure you give him this antibiotic twice a day. So we went home. Seemed like it was a pretty simple task. And that day, the first day that I had to give him the antibiotic, my wife actually had some plans. She was going to go out with her friends, and she said, Cesar, do you want me to stay? I know it's not easy when the kids are sick, and I can cancel my get together with my friends. And I, as a super dad, I was like, no, baby, don't worry. I'll take care of the kids. I'll take care of Tomas, right? Tomas is the youngest. I'll give him his medication. So she left, and she said, well, if you have any problems, give me a call. And about an hour passed, and it was time to give him his medication. And I want you to imagine this, right? I walk up to his room, and he's playing with his toys. You know, kids, even if they're sick, they'll be playing with their toys. And I was thinking in my mind, okay, how do I give him this medication? I gotta spoon feed him this syrup. And my first initial strategy, my first thought was, I'll talk to him about the benefits, right? So I said to him, hey, Tomas, look, I have this syrup, this medication. It's going to make you feel much better. It's going to help you breathe better. And I start, moving the spoon closer and closer to his mouth. And when I'm about to get to his mouth, he goes like this. No, I don't want any. I don't want any of that. Okay, I guess this is going to be a little bit harder than what I thought. So my second strategy, I said, okay, what do kids like? Well, they like to play, right? So I started doing the typical, daddy with the airplane. So I'm like, look, open your mouth. Here comes the airplane. And as I'm about to land in his mouth, he goes, no, I don't want that. That's yucky. Now I'm having a hard time, right? Now I'm running out of ideas. What do? I already talked to him about the benefits. I try to play, make it entertaining. All right, you know what I'm gonna do? And this idea that came to my head, it's not a good idea. Just I'm telling you right away. Okay, so don't even try it. I said I'm gonna try to fool him a little bit. So I walk up to him and I said, look, there's a dinosaur. And as he looks away, he's got his attention on something else. I stick the spoon in his mouth. And you can probably already imagine what he did. He starts spitting out all the medication on the floor, and then he starts crying. And that's the worst, when you have a 4 or 5-year-old kid who starts crying. And then the worst part of it is when he starts saying, I don't want you, I want mom. Where's mom? I don't like daddy, I want mommy. And I was like, oh man, I lost this battle. And I could hear these voices in my head, right? One side was saying, Cesar, you got to handle this, right? You're the dad. You got to take control. And then there was another voice that was saying, call your wife. She knows what to do. And you can probably imagine what I did. I grabbed my phone and I called my wife, right? And I said, baby, I'm trying to give Tomas his medication. He doesn't want any. I've tried to, I've talked to him about the benefits. I've played with him. I even tried to, I put the spoon in his mouth, telling her there was a dinosaur, and she was just listening to me very patiently. And at the end, she asked me a question. She said, Cesar, do we have any yogurt at home? Is there any yogurt in the fridge? And she caught me off guard. And I was like, yeah, we have yogurt, but why are you asking me that? She's like, do we have yogurt? Yes, we have yogurt. Do we have strawberry yogurt? Because that's the kind that Tomas likes. I said, yeah, we have strawberry yogurt. But what does that have to do with anything? She's like, look, I want you to go in the kitchen, grab the yogurt, okay? And I want you to mix the medicine with the yogurt. Mix the medicine with the yogurt. And then give it to Tomas. But don't tell him you're giving him the medicine. Tell him you're giving him yogurt. And he'll love it. And I was there thinking, what? It's that simple? It's that easy? I mean, I've been battling for a few minutes, and all I have to do is just give him yogurt and mix the medicine. And she said, yeah, that's all you got to do. Okay. And don't call me back. So I hung up the phone. I walked back up to his room, and I'm thinking again, what strategy am I going to use? And when I finally get into his room and he's calmed down a little bit, I say to him, Tomas, look, I have this yogurt, strawberry yogurt for you. It's really yummy. And he jumps up and he grabs the yogurt from my hand, and he starts taking all the yogurt with the medicine. And I'm there watching this, saying, this is the secret. This is the answer. All I had to do was mix the medicine with the yogurt. Mix the medicine with the yogurt. And you're probably thinking, right, as you're listening to the story, like, okay, that's very interesting, Cesar. Thank you. I've learned something about parenting, maybe what not to do. But what does this have to do with me as a business leader? What does this have to do with me as a leader? What does this have to do with me in sales and marketing? Well, you face this challenge every day. Every day, you're also trying to give your audience, whoever that audience might be, your medicine, right? You're trying to give them something that you know will help. That could be your product. That could be your service. That could be your goal. That could be your vision. That could be your message. You're trying to give your audience medicine. And probably when you're doing that, you also get some kickback, right? You also get sometimes the audience that you don't have their attention, or they don't think it's good. And you have to battle with that. And we try different strategies. We try talking about the characteristics, or we'll try to create a really nice PowerPoint presentation, or we'll try to do whatever so they can want the medicine. But the true answer, the secret, is that we have to learn to mix the medicine, that service, that product, whatever that is that we want to communicate, we have to learn to mix it with the yogurt. Think that your medicine is your idea or your message or your product or your service. Yogurt are stories. Yogurt are stories. Because just like yogurt, stories are good. Stories are something that we as human beings crave and we want. And this isn't something new. This isn't just something that I'm saying because, I'm the storytelling guy. Science, research has shown that we as human beings are naturally inclined to want to listen to stories. Our brains are hardwired to want to listen to stories. And that's because stories are not just information. Stories are information with emotion. And that is the key. Whenever we want to grab someone's attention, whenever we want to persuade, we have to not only communicate information, we have to learn how to do that with emotion. Information with emotion. And stories by essence, right? Stories by principle are the best communication tool that we as human beings have to be able to communicate information with emotion. So the good news, because I started out with bad news today, the good news is that we can all do this. The good news is that knowing how to tell good stories is something that we all in some way or another do already, because we are storytelling creatures. So we tell stories when we're at home, or we tell stories when we're with our friends. What I'm going to teach you today is actually what I call strategic storytelling. Because the difference between just storytelling, which is the art of communicating by using stories, which is something that we all do in some way or another, strategic storytelling is the art of influence. It's how do we use stories to influence the change or the transformation that we're trying to get in our audience? How do we get others to do what we want, but because they want to? And in order for you to understand how to do this, I'm actually going to teach you a very simple 4-step process to do this. And I promise you, if you pick up on the key principles that each one of these stages has, you'll be able to, at the end of this presentation, go grab a story that you already probably have in your bucket. If you make it go through these 4 steps, you'll see how the story becomes much more fluid and much more impactful. So I want you to remember this word. Okay, so today I'm not only here to teach you about storytelling, I'm actually going to teach you a Spanish word. Okay, so you're also going to get a little bit of Spanish here. I want you to remember this word, cosa. Cosa. And cosa in Spanish means thing. Okay, thing. And the reason why I want you to remember this word, cosa, or thing, is because I'm about to teach you the most important thing so you can craft a strategic story. And at the same time, this is an acronym to help you remember these 4 steps. Okay, here we go. Here we go. So the first step of any good story will always start out with a context. And the context, in simple terms, okay, just very simple terms, is where the story begins. Every story has a beginning. And in the context, you have to answer 3 questions. That's it. You answer these 3 questions and you'll create a pretty good context. You have to answer the question of, when did this story happen? Okay. When did it happen? Did it happen a week ago? Did it happen 2 weeks ago? Did it happen a few years ago? Did it happen when you were a kid? Second, where did it happen? Did it happen in your office? Did it happen at your house? Did it happen at the doctor's office? Where did it happen? And third, who did it happen to? Who are the characters in your story? Now, these 3 questions, because you've probably heard before, you got to create a context when you're communicating. Context is just answering these 3 questions so you can help your audience start imagining where the story begins. And the most important out of all these questions is who, because this is a golden rule of stories. Every story will always have a main character, right? The story that I just told you, even though it's my personal story that I'm telling you, my son, he's one of the characters of the story. My wife is one of the characters of the story. And why is it important to have characters? Because people, human beings, connect with other human beings. So part of the reason why we pay attention to an ad, we pay attention to a commercial, we pay attention to a movie, we pay attention to a book, is because there are other human beings that, as we hear their story, we feel in a way that they're telling our own story. Because the goal or the objective here in this stage, in the context, is just to create connection. What we want is for our audience who's listening to our message, who's listening to whatever we're communicating, we want them to feel some kind of connection. We want them to hopefully say, oh, what Cesar is saying, that also happened to me, or that story, or that character in the story, I feel a certain connection. I feel like they resonate with me. If you generate connection in the context of your story, now you have people's attention and they're much more willing to want to listen to the rest of the story, right? So first step, context, and the goal is to create connection. The second step, after you've created the context, now you have to go through the obstacles, right? Now you got to take the main character has to have some kind of a, what I call CDF, some kind of a challenge or some kind of difficulty, or they got to face failure. Something's got to happen. If there is no struggle, if there is no obstacle in a story, and I'm going to be very, very direct with this, the story is not worth telling. Stories are worth telling. And the reason why we connect emotionally with stories are because there's struggle. It's because there's some kind of failure. Now, this means if you're telling a story and you're telling your own personal story, it means you have to show a little bit of vulnerability. If you remember the story that I just told you about me, right? I could have positioned myself as the go-to father, as number one father, the one who knows how to solve all the problems, but I don't. I don't know how to solve the problem. I didn't know how to give my son his medication. So I struggled and I showed vulnerability. When you understand vulnerability as just the ability to show sincere and real emotion for what you're going through. That is the real definition of vulnerability when you look at it in psychological terms. And when you're telling a story, especially when you're in the conflict or in the obstacle, you have to show some sort of vulnerability in order for your story to have more credibility. So vulnerability breeds credibility. And you're all going to probably remember, if you've ever heard a story, someone tell a story and everything in their story is just good. You know, everything's going great. There's no problem. There's no issue. There's something in us, even in our subconscious, is saying, I don't think that's right. I think they're lying, or they're missing something, or they're not giving us all the information. Because again, vulnerability breeds credibility. The objective or the goal in this stage, in the obstacle, is just to try to create emotion, try to generate emotion. And in the obstacle, it's the easiest place to be able to create that emotion because you're showing vulnerability, right? You're showing emotion. So people usually will also, in a way, connect and feel the same emotion that you're feeling, whether that be frustration, anger, a little bit of, you're losing hope, or maybe you're even happy. But just show emotion in the obstacle so people can also feel emotion in the obstacle. When you've done that, now you go to the third step. And the third step of any good story is that there has to be a solution. Okay, there's always has to be a solution, or what we know as the happy ending in a story. Now, to be able to create a happy ending in a story, when we're telling a story, you really only have to answer one of two questions. Question number one, how did he or she, referring to the main character of the story, solve the issue or solve the problem? Okay, sometimes we have stories where there's a literal solution. We're telling maybe a story of a customer or a client, and we're showing them here how our product or service solved the problem. Great, that's a solution, right? But sometimes we have stories that don't have a literal solution. And those stories that don't have a literal solution, because maybe I'm telling a story of the time I failed. Maybe I'm telling the story of when I tried to start my own business and I didn't make it through, right? I struggled, and after a year I had to close down the shop. Well, even those stories have a solution if we understand that we learned something from it, right? What did he or she learn from that experience? Because at the end, the objective here in the solution of the story is just to show change or show transformation of the main character. Now, I'm about to tell you something, and I'm doing this because I'm opening up the curtain so you can really see what's behind the structure of a story. But as I teach you this, I'm probably going to burst your bubble a little bit when it comes to stories, okay? Every story you've ever heard or you've ever watched, movie, series, books, or you've heard someone tell a story, every story, in essence, what it's trying to communicate or show is the change or transformation of a character. That is the essence of all the stories that we've ever told, is just to show the change or transformation of a character. That's why it's necessary to have an obstacle, to have a conflict, because usually through the conflict or the obstacle, we can have that growth. We can have that change by solving the problem or by learning something from going through that problem. So these are 3 steps. I told you there's 4, and the 4th one's actually what transformed this whole process into a strategic story. But just want you to know that with these 3 steps, if you really hone in on what are the goals in each one of these stages, right away, your stories will be good, will be much better. If you know that we have to start with the context to create connection, then there has to be an obstacle to be able to show or generate emotion. And now there has to be a solution to show the change of the main character. The fourth and final step of this process is what's called the application. And the application is all about the audience. In the application, this is where we connect our idea or our message of how the story that I'm telling you applies to you, right? So I told you a story about my son and about me giving him the medication. And if we just finish the story there, you'd be like, oh, okay, that's an interesting story about parenting or about how to give your kid his medication. But if you remember, once I finished my story, I said, this applies to you, right? Because you, as a business owner, as a leader, you're always trying to give your audience medication. You're always trying to give them a solution. And you're always going to get a little bit of kickback if you don't know how to mix that solution in the yogurt or in the story. Because your audience, when they listen to you, they'll always be asking themselves, what does this have to do with me? What does this story have to do with me? Or why should I care? And this is why it's important that in the application, you're always remembering that the story that you're using is just a vehicle to be able to give your audience a message or an idea or a product or a service that they can apply. The objective or the goal here is now to hopefully motivate your audience to take action. Motivate them to be able to put something into action. And this is la cosa, or the thing, the most important thing. Now, if you remember this word, cosa, right? You're going to remember that every strategic story needs to have context to be able to create connection, needs to have an obstacle to be able to generate emotion, needs to have a solution to show the change of the character, and needs to have an application to be able to give your audience the message or the idea that will hopefully inspire them to change. That is la cosa, or the thing that will help you create strategic stories. Thank you.
Cesar, awesome. Thank you so much. I took a bunch of notes. Really appreciate you sharing this. Q&A time now for Cesar. What questions do you have for him? And also, Cesar, just to make sure that we get it in the chat, what's the best way for people to connect with you if they've got questions after this session?
Well, I mean, I'll give you guys directly my email in case anyone wants to connect and just, hey, I was at the Midday event. I'd like to talk with you, or I have a question. So you can send me directly an email at Cesar, C-E-S-A-R, at CesarCastro.com. Cesar is C-E-S-A-R, Castro, C-A-S-T-R-O.com. That's my direct email. Or you can go to my website, which is also www.cesarcastro.com, and just fill out the little form if you do have a question, and then someone from my team will contact you.
Awesome. Thank you. Anybody have questions? You can unmute yourself or throw them in the chat, whichever one is better. The one question I have as people are figuring out what questions they want to ask you, I missed the second bullet under context. It was when, and then something, and who.
When, where,
and
who, right?
Okay.
When refers to time. Like if you think about it, when you start a story, like any of us, if we're starting a story in a business context, we should always start similar to this. Like, a week ago, I was in my office with a client. Now, did you see the three questions I answered, right? A week ago, when, I was in my office, where, with a client, who. And the more information you give, here you have to be very strategic too, because sometimes we can fall into the trap of giving too much information, right? Like you could be like, a week ago, I don't know if it was Wednesday or Thursday, and I'm not sure if it was 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock. Like if you start giving too much information and it's not relevant for the story, people actually get lost, right? And a lot of times it happens where someone's telling a story and they're giving so much information, they're branching off to so many things that at the end of the story, you're like, and what am I supposed to get from this? What is the purpose? So we also have to be very strategic in the details that we share. For me, my North Star is always the idea or the message that I want to communicate. Whatever information or details I give in my story have to help the audience at the end understand that idea or message that I want to communicate. If it doesn't, then I can probably rip it off.
Great advice. Karen in the chat has a question. She said, when you're starting to build a story, does it matter which one you use as the jumping off point, i.e. begin my writing process with a change or transformation that I want to share about and work backwards to the context and obstacles?
Yeah, so you could, if you want to use what's called an attention grabber, right? A spark is what I call it. You could sometimes start with like the end, right? I'll give you an example. Like, and I opened my eyes and I was, I looked around and my car had just been wrecked or something like that, right? And if I start my story that way, you're looking at me like, what's going on, right? So you could use sometimes the ending of the story or even the obstacle or the conflict at the beginning, just as a way to grab people's attention. But then you got to give them context. Then you got to go to the beginning of the story, or else everything's going to kind of feel cut off, right? So if you do watch movies in Hollywood, you see that sometimes they'll do that. Well, they'll start the movie like at the begin, like in the middle of the movie, where it's like the climax, but they'll just do that to grab your attention, and then they'll go back like 48 hours before, and they'll start setting it up to that moment, right? And it's the same thing with oral stories. One of the best techniques that I've used and that I see good speakers, communicators use to grab people's attention is either asking a question, like a very probing question at the beginning, using some kind of a quote that could generate people's attention, or sometimes just starting with the story, because we all know that people are attracted to stories. So if we just start with the story, usually you'll have people's attention. The important thing obviously is for your story to be, have good rhythm and be fluid so people don't get bored or don't get lost. So my suggestion to you, especially considering stories that we can use in business presentations or in business meetings, usually I would try to work on stories that would go for about 2 to 3 minutes max, right? If you're giving a keynote, you could extend your stories a little bit longer, because the context is for that, right? When people come to a keynote, they're there to listen to the stories, so they'll give you more time. But if you're in a business presentation, 2 to 3 minutes, I think, is a good. This isn't like research or anything, just kind of my experience. I think it's good time, especially if you're using your story again as a way to introduce your product or your service, or as a way to give your message. Then it all makes sense.
Thank you. A couple of other questions in the chat. One came in from Levi. Can you tell another person's story to add credibility, or would you always use your own?
So the real challenge, like when you're a storyteller, when you really think of telling a story like a storyteller, the challenge for a storyteller is not just to tell a story and hopefully just use it as an attention grabber. What you're really trying to do is get people to live an experience. Because if you can get people to live that experience with you, that story you're telling, now you're gonna really make your story memorable. Stories, research shows, are up to 20 times more memorable than just data or information. But what they forget to say there is that good stories are 20 times more memorable, right? So you got to make sure that the story is really good, that it connects with the audience. So what I would suggest, if you're telling someone else's story, even if it's someone else's story, you can still tell it from your perspective, just by giving a little bit of context. So I'll give you just like how I would introduce, right? There's a story I tell of an author, and it's a story that I read in a book. So it's not my story, it's the author's story that he's telling of an experience he had with Stephen Covey, right? Stephen Covey, that a lot of you have probably heard of Stephen Covey. And when I tell that story, I'll usually start out saying, a few months ago, I was reading this book, really good book, that's called The Power of Influence. And in the book, in the first chapter, the author, he shares an experience he had when he went to a party and he met Stephen Covey. So do you see how I'm setting up that context, right? And now the rest of the story, I tell it as if it's my story, as if I'm the author, right? So the author, will call him Bill, right? Bill walks into this party, right? And he's walking around and he's talking to his friend. All of a sudden, at the distance, he sees Stephen Covey, and he starts thinking, should I go up to Stephen Covey? Because I'm writing a book right now, and I know Stephen Covey wrote a very successful book. Should I go ask him, like, what is it that that he do that helped him have success in his book? Now, if you notice, right now I'm telling the story, and it's as if I'm the author, right? Telling the story. I'm telling you what he's thinking, what he's feeling, but I gave you the context before, that this is a book that I was reading that caught my attention, this experience that the author had, and now I go into the story as if I'm the author. But I've already set up the context that it's not my story, it's the author's story.
That's super helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
We've got a couple more questions, and we're usually at time right now, but love these questions. And Cesar, thanks for answering these. Andy's got a question in the chat. What tips do you have when there are multiple audiences for your story? For example, in marketing content that's communicated on your website. So you've got multiple audiences. How do you make it apply, or how do you approach that?
Yeah. So my suggestion is in communication, less is always more. Okay. Just as a principle, less is more. So one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen my clients make when they're trying to either marketing or their presentation. A lot of clients hire me because they have to give presentations and they want to use storytelling to make their presentations very compelling. And the first challenge they face is that they have too many messages that they want to communicate, right? So they're like, no, there's these 5 things that I want to communicate. And I'm like, you know what? It's not going to work that way. Like the best communication strategies, usually they come down to just communicating one idea. So my rule of thumb is one story for one idea. Now, one story could be used for different ideas, right? Because that's also kind of the magic of a story, is that the same story that I told you guys about my son, I've used it to talk about sales. I've used it to talk about leadership. I've used it to talk about the importance of seeking help. You know, not always thinking you can do things on your own. So it just depends on the message you want to communicate. You could use the same story to communicate a different message. But when you are crafting a story, I would just so to make it easier for you, I would focus on one audience. And I know that in marketing material, you're like, Cesar, but I got a large audience. Yeah, but usually you could probably create like a buyer persona, which would be about 80% of your audience, right? You should have like at least a persona that you're like, if I communicate to this person, I'll at least be communicating to 80% of my audience. So I would focus there. And then if you do have that other 20% that's important for you to reach, now you can either use that same story and adapt it to that 20%, or just create a brand new story that you think will resonate more with that 20%.
Great answer. Thank you. Last question from Parker in the chat about vulnerability. If you're trying to sell your company, how do you show vulnerability without causing them to doubt your judgment or product or company?
Yeah. So this is the vulnerability part is always the hardest, especially when I'm working like one-on-one. I work with directors from big companies, right? So when you talk about vulnerability, and I'm also, just so you know my context, I was born in Latin America. I was born in Chile, in South America. So in Chile, the word vulnerabilidad or vulnerability is used to talk about weakness and poverty. That's how media talks about vulnerability, weakness and poverty. And that's kind of how we've been programmed to understand that word. Vulnerability, which really comes from psychology, right? Psychology, they're the ones that, I'm a psychologist as well, and that's the origin of the word. It comes from psychology. Vulnerability is actually considered a trait or characteristic of emotionally intelligent people. Emotionally intelligent people are vulnerable. They're not, look at me, I'm super strong, nothing ever phases me, I've only had success. So what I'm telling you is, first, to understand that vulnerability does not mean that you're weak. And that's the first thing we have to change or shift in our mind, because if I do think vulnerability is weak, then I'm never going to show any emotion. Even when I'm talking about my business, I'm never going to talk about any of the struggles, because they're going to think I'm weak, right? Vulnerability is actually a strength if we understand it as your ability to show genuinely your emotions. And all the research shows that when you're with someone who can show vulnerability, it actually connects you more and it makes them more credible, right? Now, when you're telling a story, that's why I said that in the obstacle is where you show vulnerability. And after the obstacle, there's always a solution. So if I'm pitching my company, right? If I'm pitching my company and I'm telling the story of my business, I'm not going to just say, everything's been great since we started, our growth has been like this and that, because there's probably been struggle. There's probably at the beginning, it was hard to understand the market, or at the beginning you had a lot of competition, and we were with our team, nights without sleeping, thinking, how do we communicate to our audience? Because, they're being bombarded by information. Like, by just expressing a little bit of obstacle, a little bit of challenge, what actually will do is it'll make the solution much more impactful, right? It'll make it way more. Like, we need to understand that in order for something to be really sweet, we first have to try a little bit of salt, right? If everything's sweet, it loses its sweetness. But when we're telling a story and we're able to show a little bit of salty, a little bit of sour, and then comes the solution, which is the sweet, it'll actually make your solution stand out even more. So your business or your company, it'll make it even more memorable and even more valuable because it's gone through things that now you're here when at first you were here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is great advice. Cesar, we're at time right now, but I feel like I've only had one bite of yogurt and I want the rest of the cup. So how do I or other people work with you? Like, what is your model? How could we get more education around storytelling or get helps telling our stories?
Okay, so one of my important projects, I started a podcast. I have a podcast in Spanish that's called Storytelling Estratégico, or Strategic Storytelling. And it's one of the most downloaded podcasts in Spanish, and on storytelling, because there's not a lot of podcasts that just dedicate, everything to storytelling. So this year, a few months ago, I started the project of the storytelling podcast, the Strategic Storytelling Podcast. You can find it on iTunes, Spotify. And so far, we've recorded about 6 episodes, and it's a project where we're going to record about 20 episodes during the year. And on each episode, I'll share a little bit of yogurt, okay, a little bit of application, a little bit of techniques. Because right now, I just showed you the model, the skeleton, but obviously there's a lot of things that go in the skeleton to be able to make your story memorable, right? Dialogues and details and gestures and pauses, all those things make your stories really, really become powerful. So one thing I would suggest is the podcast, or again, you guys have my email and you have my website. What I do professionally is I train companies with this. So I usually, companies bring me in to train their leaders on storytelling, whether it be in like workshops or give a keynote if we need to inspire the leaders to be able to become better communicators and storytellers. And a lot of times companies will have me work directly with certain directors who need to become very good storytellers, so their messages, their presentations can become much more impactful. So if you feel that you need to be a better storyteller for your business, for your brand, or you need help creating good stories for your business or your brand, just contact me through my email, through my website, and I'd be happy to have a meeting and see what you're needing, and we'll base it off of that.
Awesome. Cesar, thanks so much. This was amazing. So helpful. And I would recommend anybody reach out to Cesar if you've got more questions. He's phenomenal. So thank you so much for sharing this. We'll post the video, and Cesar said that he would share the slides with us, and we'll send those out as well. The email was cesar@cesarcastro.com.
Yeah, right there.
We go. Okay. So grab that email before we close up shop. But thanks everybody for coming to the Midday Connect. Great to have you here. We'll be back here next Tuesday. Really appreciate you, and we'll see you all later.
Thanks so much.
Cesar.
Take care.